The sun was setting behind the city skyline, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement beneath the bridge. The air smelled of damp concrete and old rainwater. James Holloway sat on a thin blanket he called his bed, staring at the cars zooming past above him. His clothes were worn out, his jacket patched together with duct tape, his boots scuffed from years of walking nowhere in particular. James had been living like this for 3 years now. 3 long, hard years since he came back from Iraq. People often thought being homeless meant you didn't care about anything anymore. They couldn't have been more wrong. Every day, James cared too much. About surviving, about finding food, about staying warm when winter hit. But most of all, he cared about holding on to what little pride he had left. He used to be someone important once. Back then, people looked up to him. He wore a uniform that made him feel invincible, standing shoulder to shoulder with men and women who would die for each other without hesitation. That was before everything fell apart. Before the nightmares started haunting him every night. Before the government stamped less than honorable across his discharge papers because of something they said he did, but which, deep down, he knew wasn't entirely his fault. Now, no one even noticed him unless they wanted him to move along, and sometimes not even then. That evening, as usual, James leaned against the cold stone wall under the bridge. His stomach growled. It had been hours since his last meal, a granola bar handed to him by a kind stranger earlier that morning. As darkness settled in, so did the chill. Pulling his jacket tighter around himself, he closed his eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly. Sleep was his only escape these days, but tonight, fate decided otherwise. It happened fast. One moment James was trying to rest, and the next flashing red and blue lights lit up the area beneath the bridge. 2 police officers approached him, their flashlights cutting through the dimness. "Sir," one of them said firmly, "you can't stay here." James blinked, confused. He hadn't done anything wrong. All he'd done was try to find a quiet spot where no one bothered him. Still, arguing never helped matters. So, he slowly got to his feet, clutching his small backpack, the only thing he owned besides the clothes on his back. "I'm leaving," he muttered, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't resisting. But things escalated quicker than expected. Maybe it was the way he moved, or maybe it was just how tired and defeated he looked. Whatever the reason, one officer grabbed his arm roughly, demanding ID. James flinched instinctively, memories flooding back from nights spent dodging gunfire overseas. Panic surged through him and he pulled away. "Let go," he shouted, his voice cracking. It wasn't defiance. It was fear. The struggle lasted mere seconds, but it felt like forever. By the time it ended, handcuffs were clicking shut around his wrists. James barely registered what was happening as he was shoved into the backseat of the patrol car. The world outside blurred past the window as they drove away, leaving the bridge, and whatever semblance of safety it offered, behind. At Yabe, the station, James was booked for resisting arrest and violating some vague ordinance about loitering near financial institutions. None of it made sense to him. How could sitting quietly under a bridge hurt anyone? But arguing wouldn't change anything. Instead, he kept quiet, letting the system do what it always did, chew him up and spit him out. Days passed in a haze. James was given a court date and assigned a public defender, a young woman named Linda who seemed overwhelmed by her caseload. She told him not to worry, that cases like his usually resulted in fines or community service. But James knew better. Nothing about his life had gone smoothly in years. Why should this be any different? On the morning of his trial, James stood outside the courthouse feeling smaller than ever. His heart pounded as he walked through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the room buzzed with activity. Lawyers whispered urgently to clients, clerks shuffled papers, and judges barked orders from behind raised benches. James took a seat in the corner, clutching his hat nervously between his hands. Around him, people talked and laughed, completely unaware of the storm raging inside him. Would anyone believe him if he tried to explain? Would anyone care? As he waited for his name to be called, James glanced around the crowded courtroom. For a brief moment he caught the eye of the judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze. Something about her expression gave him pause. There was a flicker of recognition there, though he couldn't imagine why. Little did James know those few seconds would change everything, not just for him but for everyone watching. Because when the judge finally spoke his name aloud, the entire room would rise in unison, united by a single truth. This man deserved far better than the hand life had dealt him. The courtroom was buzzing with its usual chaos. Lawyers whispered to their clients, court clerks shuffled papers, and the faint hum of murmured conversations filled the air. James sat stiffly in his chair near the back, his hands gripping the brim of his worn-out hat. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The room felt too big, too loud, and far too judgmental for a man who just wanted to disappear. When the bailiff called out his name, James Holloway III, he flinched slightly before standing up. His legs felt heavy as he walked toward the front of the courtroom. For a moment he hesitated, unsure where exactly to stand or what to do next. His public defender, Linda, gave him a quick nod, signaling that he should step forward. The judge, an older woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced down at the file in front of her. She adjusted her glasses and began reading aloud the charges against him: resisting arrest and violating some obscure city ordinance about loitering near financial institutions. To James, it all sounded absurd. He hadn't hurt anyone. He hadn't stolen anything. All he'd done was try to survive another day under the bridge. But then something strange happened. As the judge spoke his full name, James Holloway III, her voice faltered ever so slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but James noticed. Everyone did. She paused mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to place something. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to continue. Instead, she set the file down gently and looked directly at James. Her gaze wasn't cold or dismissive like so many others had been over the years. There was something else there: curiosity, maybe even recognition. "Mr. Holloway," she said slowly, her tone softer now. "How old are you?" Caught off guard, James stammered. 58, ma'am." She nodded thoughtfully, then turned to the bailiff. "Take a 5-minute recess," she instructed, rising from her seat. The gavel struck once, and the room erupted into low whispers as people filed out or huddled together, speculating about what was going on. In her chambers, Judge Langston closed the door behind her and leaned against her desk, staring at the framed photograph hanging on the wall. It was a picture of her late father, a retired Army colonel, dressed in full uniform. Beside him stood another man, younger, broader-shouldered, but unmistakably familiar. That man was James Holloway. Her father had spoken often about him, always, with deep respect and admiration. According to the stories, James had saved his life during the Gulf War when their unit came under heavy fire. Against all odds, James had dragged her father to safety, shielding him from bullets with his own body. Her father never forgot that act of bravery, and neither had she. Returning to the courtroom, Judge Langston took her seat again, her expression unreadable. She motioned for the bailiff to call James back to the stand. When he approached, looking more nervous than ever, she asked, "Mr. Holloway, have you served in the military?" James blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly. "Iraq, 2 tours." "And your rank?" she pressed. "Sergeant," he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure why. This line of questioning mattered. Wasn't he here because of panhandling and resisting arrest? What did any of this have to do with his past? The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to the prosecutor and requested a background check on James. "I want everything. His service record, discharge papers, the works," she ordered. The prosecutor nodded, clearly confused but unwilling to argue with her. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew palpable. People exchanged glances, wondering what was happening. Some whispered theories to each other while others simply stared at James, trying to piece together the mystery unfolding before them. Finally, The clerk returned with a thick folder containing copies of James's military records. The judge flipped through them quickly, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. She stopped at one document, a recommendation for a Bronze Star signed by several high-ranking officers. According to the paperwork, James had been nominated for the medal after leading a dangerous mission that resulted in the safe extraction of his entire platoon. But beneath the commendation was a note stating that the award was ultimately denied, due to unspecified disciplinary issues. Her jaw tightened as she read further. James's discharge status was listed as less than honorable, but there were annotations suggesting that the decision had been disputed internally. Someone higher up had recommended upgrading it to honorable, yet nothing had come of it. It appeared to be a bureaucratic oversight, one that had cost James dearly. Judge Langston closed the folder and looked at James again. This time her expression was different. Gone was the stern authority figure. In her place was someone who understood pain, injustice, and the weight of carrying burdens alone. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "it seems there may have been mistakes made regarding your service record." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We're going to get to the bottom of this." The courtroom fell silent. No one dared to breathe as the gravity of the situation settled over them. James, for his part, looked utterly bewildered. He didn't know what to say or whether he should say anything at all. Linda, his attorney, stepped forward cautiously. "Your Honor, does this mean—" "It means," the judge interrupted, her tone firm, "that we need to verify these documents thoroughly. Until then, I'm ordering a stay on all proceedings against Mr. Holloway. Furthermore, I'm directing the Department of Veterans Affairs and the National Archives to assist us in clarifying the discrepancies in his record." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded approvingly, while others exchanged skeptical looks. Whatever was happening, it was clear that this case had taken an unexpected turn. For James, the whole thing felt surreal. One moment, he was just another homeless veteran facing petty charges. The next, he was at the center of something much bigger, something he couldn't fully comprehend yet. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, someone seemed to care about what had happened to him. As the judge adjourned the session, James remained rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next. Linda touched his arm gently, pulling him aside. "This is good news," she assured him. "Really good news." But James wasn't convinced. Good news didn't usually stick around for long in his world. Still, he allowed himself a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally starting to change. The days following the abrupt halt of James's trial were a whirlwind. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone in navigating his life. People were asking questions, not just about him, but for him. It was strange, almost surreal, to feel like someone cared enough to dig deeper into his past. But as the pieces of his story started coming together, James couldn't help but wonder if this newfound attention would make any real difference, or if it would all slip away again, leaving him right back where he started. Linda, his public defender, became a constant presence in his life. She visited him at the shelter where he'd been staying temporarily, armed with folders full of documents and notes from phone calls she'd made on his behalf. Each time she showed up, her face lit up a little more, as though she were piecing together a puzzle that had been hidden for far too long. "James," she said one afternoon, spreading out photocopies of military records on the small table in the shelter's common room. "Do you remember this?" She pointed to a document recommending him for a Bronze Star. The words on the page were faded but still legible. "For acts of valor under fire." James squinted at the paper, his heart pounding. He remembered the mission vividly. The chaos, the gunfire, the way his team relied on him to get them out alive. What he didn't remember was ever receiving recognition for it. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought they forgot about us. About me." "Well, they didn't forget completely," Linda replied, tapping another sheet. "Look here. This memo says your discharge status was supposed to be upgraded to honorable. Someone higher up signed off on it, but it never happened." Her tone shifted to frustration. It looks like some clerical error buried. Your file, you were left hanging. James leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. All these years he'd carried the weight of shame from that less than honorable discharge. He'd blamed himself for losing everything, his dignity, his home, his sense of purpose. Now it seemed the truth was much uglier than self-blame. A mistake, a simple oversight, had derailed his entire life. Meanwhile, Judge Langston wasn't sitting idle either. After ordering the court to pause proceedings, she took matters into her own hands. She contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs, demanding answers. She reached out to retired military officials who might have known James during his service. And she even tracked down old comrades of his, men who had served alongside him in Iraq. One of those men, a grizzled veteran named Joe, agreed to testify on James's behalf. Over the phone, Joe recounted stories of James's leadership and bravery, under pressure. "He saved our lives more times than I can count," Joe told Linda during their conversation. "If anyone deserves honor, it's him." As word spread about James's situation, the case began drawing attention beyond the courthouse walls. Local news outlets picked up the story, painting a picture of a forgotten hero fighting not only for justice, but also for survival. Viewers were moved by the image of a man who had sacrificed so much, only to be abandoned by the system meant to protect him. Donations poured in, money for housing, food, legal fees. Strangers sent letters of encouragement, sharing their own struggles, or thanking him for his service. But James found it hard to process all the sudden kindness. Sitting in the shelter one evening, he stared at the stack of envelopes piled on his cot. Some contained cash, others heartfelt notes. He felt grateful, yes, but also uneasy. These people saw him as a symbol, a cause worth rallying behind. Yet inside, he still felt broken, unworthy of their generosity. "I don't know how to handle this," he admitted to Linda when she stopped by later that week. "All these people, they're looking at me like I'm some kind of hero, but I don't feel like one." She sat down beside him, her expression soft but firm. "You don't have to feel like a hero to be one, James. Sometimes being brave isn't about charging into battle. It's about surviving when everything around you is falling apart. That's what you've done, and now it's time for the world to see that." Despite her reassurance, James struggled to shake the feeling that none of this would last. Every door that opened for him felt like it could slam shut just as quickly. Still, he clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Back at the courthouse, Judge Langston worked tirelessly to ensure that change came swiftly. She called an emergency meeting with local veterans organizations, law enforcement agencies, and government representatives. Together, they drafted a plan to address systemic failures that left soldiers like James stranded after their service ended. The judge insisted on creating a new initiative, a special court designed specifically to assist veterans facing minor offenses, offering them rehabilitation instead of punishment. "Our veterans deserve better," she declared during the meeting. "They gave everything for us. It's our duty to give something back." By the time James returned to court, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters lined the benches, cameras clicking quietly as he entered the room. Spectators whispered among themselves, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man whose name had become synonymous with resilience and redemption. Even the bailiff seemed unusually respectful, nodding subtly as he passed. When Judge Langston took her seat, the courtroom fell silent. She looked directly at James, her expression calm but resolute. "Mr. Holloway," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimonies from those who served with you, we have confirmed that your discharge status should indeed be upgraded to honorable. Furthermore, we are expediting your application for VA benefits, including housing assistance and medical care." A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by applause. James stood frozen, his chest tightening as the reality of her words sank in. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them back, unwilling to let himself break down in front of everyone. "There's more," the judge continued, raising her hand to quiet the room. "In light of these findings, all charges against you are hereby dismissed. Additionally, I am commissioning a formal ceremony to present you with the honors you were denied decades ago." The courtroom erupted once again, this time with cheers and standing ovations. James glanced around, stunned by the sea of faces smiling at him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. As he stepped outside afterward, the late afternoon sun warmed his skin. Linda walked beside him, chatting excitedly about next steps, but James barely heard her. His mind was racing, replaying every moment of the past few weeks. From sleeping under a bridge to standing in a courtroom filled with people rising in his honor, it was almost too much to comprehend. Yet amidst the chaos, one thought remained clear. Maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything after all. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with anticipation. Reporters jostled for seats near the front, their cameras clicking softly as they adjusted lenses. Spectators whispered among themselves, some craning their necks to catch a glimpse of James Holloway, who sat quietly in the corner looking smaller than ever. His hands rested on his knees, fingers nervously tapping against the worn fabric of his jeans. Despite everything that had happened over the past few days, he still felt out of place, like an outsider watching his own life unfold from afar. Judge Langston entered the room, her presence commanding immediate silence. She carried herself with authority, but there was something different about her today. Her usual stern expression softened slightly as she took her seat behind the bench. For a moment, she simply looked at James, studying him as though seeing not just the man before her, but also the weight of all he'd endured. "Mr. Holloway?" she began, her voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "Before we proceed, I want to address something important." She paused, glancing around the room, making sure every eye was on her. "This is not just another case. This is about a man who served his country honorably, only to be failed by the very system he swore to protect." Her words hung heavy in the air, and James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, not like this. All his life, he'd tried to blend into the background, to disappear when things got too hard. But now everyone was looking at him, waiting for him to say or do something meaningful. The pressure was almost unbearable. The judge continued, her tone growing firmer. "When I first heard your name during this trial, it struck a chord within me. My father, a retired colonel, spoke often of a soldier named James Holloway who saved his life during the Gulf War. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But when I saw your face and read your file..." She trailed off, shaking her head, as if trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. James's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that day vividly. The firefight, the chaos, the split-second decision to throw himself over the colonel to shield him from shrapnel. He hadn't thought much about it afterward. It was just part of the job. But apparently, the colonel never forgot. "I contacted my father's old unit," Judge Langston went on, "and spoke with several of your comrades. They confirmed what I suspected. You are the same man my father spoke so highly of. A hero who put others before himself, even at great personal cost." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded approvingly, while others wiped away tears. James stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes weren't homeless. Heroes didn't spend years sleeping under bridges and begging for scraps. Heroes didn't lose everything because of a mistake, buried deep in some forgotten file cabinet. But Judge Langston wasn't finished. Rising from her seat, she removed her judicial robe, revealing a plain black suit underneath. The act sent a ripple of shock through the room. Judges rarely stepped down from their benches, let alone shed the symbol of their authority. Yet here she was, walking toward James with purpose. Stopping a few feet away, she turned to face the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice ringing clear and strong, "this man deserves our respect. Not just as a veteran, but as a human being who has suffered far more than anyone should have to endure." Then, without hesitation, she extended her hand to James. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway, for your service and for saving my father's life." For a long moment, James hesitated. His mind raced, unsure how to respond. Finally, he reached out, his calloused hand trembling as it met hers. The gesture seemed to ignite something in the room. Slowly, one by one, people began rising to their feet. First, it was the bailiff, then the prosecutor, followed by the jury, the spectators, and even the reporters. Within seconds, the entire courtroom was standing, united in a show of respect that brought tears to many eyes, including James's. He stood there, overwhelmed, as applause filled the space. It started softly, almost tentatively, but quickly, grew louder, echoing off the walls like thunder. People clapped not just for James, but for every veteran who had been overlooked, mistreated, or forgotten. In that moment, the courtroom transformed from a place of judgment into a sanctuary of gratitude. When the applause finally died down, Judge Langston returned to her bench, her expression resolute. "All charges against Mr. Holloway are hereby dismissed," she announced. "Furthermore, I am ordering the county to provide immediate assistance with housing and reintegration services. And," she paused, allowing her next words to sink in, "I will personally ensure that Mr. Hollowton receives the honors and recognition he has earned." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, James remained rooted to the spot. His heart pounded in his chest, threatening to burst. He wanted to believe this was real, that the nightmare he'd lived for years was finally over, but it was hard to trust anything anymore. Too many promises had been broken, too many doors slammed shut. Linda, his attorney, approached him, her face glowing with pride. "You did it, James," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning." He managed a weak smile, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Now," she replied, "you start rebuilding, one step at a time." Outside the courthouse, the scene was surreal. News vans lined the street, reporters shouting questions as James emerged into the sunlight. Strangers stopped to shake his hand, offering words of encouragement. Some handed him envelopes containing donations, while others simply hugged him, tears streaming down their faces. It was overwhelming, but also strangely comforting. For the first time in years, James felt like he belonged somewhere, even if only for a moment. Later that evening, back at the shelter where he'd been staying temporarily, James sat alone, on his cot, staring at the stack of letters and cards people had given him. Each one contained messages of hope, gratitude, and solidarity. One note, written in shaky handwriting, read, "Thank you for reminding us what true courage looks like. You're not invisible anymore." Tears welled up in his eyes as he folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Maybe, just maybe, he could believe that. The days following the trial were a blur of activity for James. For the first time in years, he wasn't scrambling to survive from one moment to the next. Instead, people were scrambling to help him. It was overwhelming, but also deeply humbling. Every door that had been slammed shut in his face now seemed to open willingly, and sometimes even eagerly. Linda, his attorney, stayed by his side through it all, guiding him step by step as he navigated this new chapter of his life. "You've got options now," she told him one morning over coffee at a diner near the shelter. The waitress recognized James from the news and refused to let him pay for his meal. He smiled awkwardly, still unused to being treated like someone special. "Options?" James repeated, stirring sugar into his cup absent-mindedly. "Feels more like I'm standing at a crossroads with no idea which way to go." "That's okay," Linda replied gently. "You don't have to figure everything out right away. What matters is that you're taking the first steps toward rebuilding your life, and you're not doing it alone." True to her word, Linda connected James with local nonprofits dedicated to helping veterans. One organization provided him with temporary housing, a small studio apartment furnished with donated items. Another arranged counseling sessions with a therapist who specialized in PTSD. At first, James resisted the idea of therapy. Talking about his pain felt too raw, too vulnerable. But after just one session, he realized how much he'd been carrying, inside without ever letting anyone see. Slowly, he began unpacking the weight he'd carried for decades. Meanwhile, The public response to his story continued to grow. Donations poured in. Not just money, but clothes, groceries, job offers, and heartfelt letters. People wanted to help, to make up for the years they hadn't noticed him. James struggled to reconcile their generosity with the guilt he still felt. He didn't see himself as deserving of such kindness. To him, he was still just a man who had failed his family, his country, and most of all, himself. But the world around him saw something different. They saw a hero who had sacrificed everything only to be abandoned by the system meant to protect him. That narrative took root quickly, spreading far beyond the city limits. Soon, James found himself invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even a veterans conference held downtown. His first speaking engagement was terrifying. Standing in front of a room full of strangers, many of them teenagers, made his palms sweat and his heart race. What could he possibly say that would matter? But as he began sharing his story, the struggles, the mistakes, the moments of hope, he saw something shift in the audience. Their eyes widened, their heads nodded, and some wiped away tears. By the end of his speech, the applause was thunderous. Afterward, a young girl approached him, clutching a notebook. She looked no older than 12. "Thank you for telling us your story," she said shyly. "My dad was in the army too, but he doesn't talk about it much. Now I think I understand why." James knelt down so he could look her in the eye. "Tell your dad it's okay to talk," he said softly. "Sometimes we need to hear that we're not alone." That interaction stuck with him long after the event ended. It reminded him that his story wasn't just about him. It was about everyone else who had walked a similar path. If he could give voice to their pain, maybe it would help others find their own. Back home, James started volunteering at a shelter for homeless veterans. He knew firsthand what it felt like to sleep on cold floors and beg for scraps, and he wanted to offer guidance to those still trapped in that cycle. On his first day, he sat across from a younger man named Alex, who reminded him of himself 20 years ago, lost, angry, and convinced the world had forgotten him. "You'll get through this," James told him, leaning forward slightly. "It won't be easy, but you're stronger than you think, and you're not alone." Alex stared at him skeptically, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. James recognized it immediately. Hope was fragile, but it was also powerful, if nurtured properly. As weeks turned into months, James settled into a routine. He attended therapy regularly, worked part-time at a local warehouse, and spent his evenings mentoring other veterans. His studio apartment became a sanctuary, filled with second-hand furniture and mementos gifted by strangers. A framed photo of him shaking hands with Judge Langston hung proudly on the wall, a reminder of how far he'd come. One evening, as he prepared dinner in his tiny kitchen, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Judge Langston standing there, holding a bouquet of flowers. She smiled warmly, looking almost unrecognizable without her robes or gavel. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, handing him the flowers. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." James stepped aside, inviting her in. "Doing better than I ever thought possible," he admitted, gesturing for her to sit. "Still adjusting, though. Feels strange to wake up every morning knowing I have somewhere safe to stay." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Adjusting takes time. But I'm proud of you, Mr. Holloway. You've already accomplished so much." They talked for nearly an hour, discussing everything from the progress of her Veterans Dignity Court initiative to James's plans for the future. Before leaving, she handed him an envelope. Inside was an invitation to a formal ceremony, honoring his service. "This time," she promised, "you'll receive the recognition you deserve." On the day of the ceremony, James wore a suit borrowed from a friend. As he stood on stage, surrounded by fellow veterans, military officials, and cheering spectators, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known since his days in uniform. When they pinned the Bronze Star medal onto his lapel, tears streamed down his face, not just for himself, but for every soldier who had been overlooked or forgotten. Afterward, as he posed for photos and accepted handshakes, A reporter asked him what message he wanted to share with others in his situation. James paused, thinking carefully before answering. "Don't give up," he said finally, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "No matter how hard things get, keep fighting. Because somewhere out there, someone cares enough to listen. And if you can hold on long enough to find them, they might just remind you that you're worth saving." The crowd erupted into applause, but James barely heard it. All he could focus on was the truth behind his words. Redemption was possible, even for those who believed they'd lost everything. Months had passed since the ceremony, and James's life was beginning to feel like something stable, something real. The studio apartment he called home wasn't fancy, but it was his. Every morning, he woke up to sunlight streaming through the window, a stark contrast to the cold, damp darkness under the bridge where he used to sleep. He brewed coffee in a small machine someone had donated, savoring the quiet moments before heading out for the day. James threw himself into his work at the warehouse, finding satisfaction in the steady rhythm of physical labor. It kept his mind occupied, gave him purpose, and allowed him to save money for the first time in years. But what truly lit a fire inside him was his volunteer work at the shelter. Helping other veterans navigate their struggles became more than just a way to give back. It was therapy for James too. Listening to their stories, offering advice born from his own pain, reminded him how far he'd come while keeping him grounded in gratitude. One evening after finishing his shift at the warehouse, James walked to the shelter with a bag of groceries he'd picked up on the way. Inside, the familiar faces greeted him warmly. Some were regulars, men and women who had become like family over the months. Others were new arrivals, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and despair. To them, James represented hope, a living example that things could get better if they held on long enough. He sat down across from one of the newcomers, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a haunted look in his eyes. "What brings you here?" James asked softly, sliding a sandwich across the table. The man hesitated, staring at the food as though unsure whether to trust it or the person offering it. Finally he spoke, his voice rough and low. "Lost everything," he muttered. "Job, house, family. Couldn't keep it together." James nodded knowingly. "I've been there," he said simply. "Felt like the whole world forgot about me. But let me tell you something, they haven't. You're not invisible no matter how much it feels like you are." The man glanced up, meeting James's gaze for the first time. There was skepticism there, but also curiosity. "How'd you turn it around?" James leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully about how to answer. "Honestly, I didn't do it alone. People showed up when I needed them most. People like Judge Langston, Linda, even strangers who saw my story on the news. They reminded me that I mattered, that my service mattered." He paused, leaning forward again. "But the hardest part was believing them. Once I started trusting that maybe I deserved a second chance, things began to change." The man listened intently, his expression softening slightly. By the end of their conversation, he agreed to meet with a counselor and apply for VA benefits. Watching him leave, James felt a flicker of pride. Maybe he couldn't fix everyone's problems, but he could offer a starting point, a lifeline, for those drowning in hopelessness. Meanwhile, Judge Langston's initiative, the Veterans Dignity Court, was gaining momentum. Modeled after similar programs in other cities, it focused on redirecting nonviolent offenders who were veterans toward rehabilitation instead of incarceration. The goal was simple: address the root causes of their struggles, whether PTSD, homelessness, or substance abuse, and provide them with resources to rebuild their lives. James attended the court's inaugural session as a guest speaker. Standing before a room filled with judges, lawyers, social workers, and veterans, he shared his journey openly and honestly. "When I stood in this courtroom months ago," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat, "I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. This court isn't just about justice. It's about giving people like me a fighting chance." His words resonated deeply with everyone present. As he stepped off the podium, Judge Langston approached, her eyes glistening with tears. "You've done more for this cause than I ever could have hoped," she told him. "Thank you for being brave enough to share your truth." In the weeks that followed, James continued speaking at events, advocating not only for veterans but for anyone marginalized by society. His speeches grew more polished, yet they never lost their raw authenticity. He spoke about resilience, forgiveness, and the importance of community. Each time, he ended with the same message: we're stronger, together. No one should have to face their battles alone. Despite his growing visibility, James remained humble. Fame wasn't what drove him. Connection was. Whether it was mentoring a struggling veteran, shaking hands with a stranger who recognized him from the news, or simply sitting quietly in his apartment reflecting on how far he'd come, he cherished every moment of his newfound life. One chilly winter afternoon, James found himself standing outside the courthouse where everything had changed. The statue of Lady Justice loomed above him, blindfolded and holding her scales. For so long, he'd felt betrayed by the system she represented. Now, though, he saw her differently, as a symbol of possibility, of fairness restored. He smiled to himself, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. Life hadn't given him an easy road, but it had taught him something invaluable. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it and finding strength in the cracks. As he turned to walk away, a young boy passing by stopped and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is that the guy from TV? The child whispered loudly. James chuckled, nodding politely as he passed. Yes, he was that guy, the homeless veteran who once felt invisible. And now? Now he was proof that even the hardest battles could be won with a little help, a lot of courage, and the belief that no one should be left behind. Walking down the street, James felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of his past still lingered, but it no longer crushed him. Instead, it fueled him, reminding him why he fought, not just for himself, but for everyone still waiting for their turn to rise.